So you'll want to register for that sessions. It's one of our quick links, go.osu.edu/seed sharing. And lots of you have. I think we have 1,000 people already signed up for that one. And then I also wanted to let you know that we have a Bumblebee short course coming up. It starts in March. So we're going to have 6 Fridays a little later in the day. So 1 to 2:30 Eastern, we'll have the Bumblebee short course starting in mid-March and going through mid-April. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Deborah Kanapke, who is an author, a lecturer, an instructor. She teaches lots of different plant material courses. She does a lot of presentations to groups. She's a garden designer. As Julia mentioned, she's very involved in the community. She helps there at Chadwick. She also works with the Governor's Mansion that has a really wonderful native plant landscape there. Very involved with community issues and in ecological and sustainable gardening, known also as the Garden Sage. So Deb, thanks so much for coming this morning. You can go ahead and start your slides. I really appreciate your being with us and teaching us about how we can incorporate some of these great native plants that we've learned about into our own landscapes.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Denise, for the introduction and also the burning question that seems to get asked every time Denise and I are together is, are we sisters? Not biologically, but I would say spiritually and ecologically we are. So there you go. It's funny that comes up a lot. And there's another person in the horticulture industry who we look very similar and we've been asked the same question. So yes, you have many sisters in this world. So my job today is to talk about native plants, some design information. How do you make choices and decisions? And just, I'm thinking, how do I encapsulate design into 50 minutes when I teach several quarters or semesters now on that? So here it is. This is a scatter shot of so many ideas. Just come along for the ride and let's see where we end up. So this is part of my backyard. And there are many native plants, and I'll get back to what's actually back here now, but this was a picture I took back in about 2012. And unfortunately, another thing that I do have in this backyard are invasive plants, which is not something I'll talk a lot about today, but I just want you to know that I know many of you are battling invasive plants, and I have battled it for the 37 years that I've lived on this property. So when people ask me, what is an invasive plant? I say it's tenacious and almost impossible to get rid of. So there you are. So our gardens, our home places. And if COVID has taught us anything, we really want our home places to reflect who we are. For us, it's a place, it's a space. It is our space. We have ideas and we have themes we want our garden to reflect. And there are many ideas, and a lot of times we have to be careful how much we want, because then we'll get nothing done. A garden is where something happens, growth and change. You can depend on it. And for those that put in a landscape and say, okay, I'm done now, that's not the way nature works. And our gardens are an ecology created by us that is full of life. Its foundation is the soil, and it is an environment that by creating, we are responsible for maintaining and supporting. So why do we design places? So this is a border that I created. It no longer looks anything like this. Well, maybe a couple things. There are 4 native plants in here. The rest are non-natives. As a horticulturist, I like to grow everything. I have so many choices. And the only time I can fit something in, as you can see in this border, is when something dies. So as things pass on in my garden, different areas change. But the 4 native plants, if you've spotted them, the Baptisia in the far right, the oak leaf hydrangea in the lower left, and in the middle, they will be revealed later in late summer and early fall, are two, at that time, Cimicifuga, but we now call them Actea, or the, oh, good golly. Isn't it funny? I can remember the botanical names much more than I can the common names, and it'll come to me later. Bugbeans. There we go. So one of the reasons we garden is to create beauty, to beautify a space, to make it beautiful for us. And sometimes it's a bit of a challenge with the Joneses next door. We also garden to support and to save. Would you believe, for those of you who are not butterfly aficionados, these two caterpillars are actually the same species. A caterpillar has 4 instars, a butterfly caterpillar, 4 changes it goes through. And what you're looking at, the beautiful sort of, I don't know what you call sea green caterpillar in the upper left, is the 4th instar of the spice bush swallowtail. And if you look at the bird poop one, in fact, the first instar looks like a little droplet of bird poop, and then it gets closer and closer, and I believe this is the 3rd instar of the spice bush swallowtail. And it makes me question, why does nature take something that's nicely camouflaged and looks like bird poop and turn it into a beacon saying, here I am, eat me? Because that's really an obvious caterpillar when you see it in its 4th instar. We also repair soil. If you're in a new build, and a new build can go back as far as 25, 50, 75 years, where the soil is disturbed, and especially more recently when we brought in the big machines and we build big houses, and we really rip up the soil. A big job of a gardener is to give back to the soil, to get that nutrient recycling going back, and to get the biological community back to where it was before this. It's also to teach. We use our community gardens to make connections, to bring people together, to not only heal the earth, but to heal the connections we have between people. And honestly, I can't think of anything that brings people more together than to grow food and flowers and herbs, and then to use those. And the children here at Highland Avenue, the Highland Youth Community Garden, it's just amazing how excited they are. You can't help but smile when you're there. We also garden to amaze. Those special plants, those special events we have in our gardens. And if you look, this is at the Atlanta Botanic Garden. I was there in 2017, which was the year after Moana came out, if you remember Moana. And I came around the corner and saw this, and she's huge. And I was with a group of people, and we were just snapping our cameras and our phones like crazy. And we garden to calm and to inspire, to get back our mental health, to relieve our stresses. And if it's anything that COVID taught me, is that my garden, other than my family, is the most important thing in my life. We also garden to grow. And this is a design. I want you to take a look at this, because this is a balcony next to where my son and daughter-in-law used to live in Cincinnati. And look at the care in the placement of the tomatoes and the staking of the tomatoes and the blue and yellow chairs that match the watering can. That is design of the first order. And it's simple, but it's design, and it's loving design. And it's healthy design too, growing your own food. So excuse me, just a moment. So how do we design places? Well, we love the pretty. It always comes down to making an attractive place. And this is at a public garden, and it's a formal design with repeated plants and hardscape that is repeated, and those beautiful boxwood stones up on the, that's what the big round things are called when you do that with boxwood stones up on the wall. and then repeat it over on the other side. We also use historical constructs. This is the cloisters in New York City, and it actually was built in 1933 to look like a cloisters that you would have seen in high medieval Europe, 1100s, 1200s. And the garden is supposed to look like that too, although I seriously doubt that there would have been grass underneath a tree. It would have been more of a flowery mead. So, but as you're looking at this, you can see herbs and you can see just a lot of plants, what we call the cottage garden style. And again, based on kind of a historical construct. And here we create a place for repose, for contemplation. We look at, well, shade to me always is a calming place. And this is at Stonecrop Gardens in New York City. An amazing garden. If you're ever in Westchester County, please stop. By the way, I noticed that we have people from all over the country in Canada, and I saw South Africa, so welcome. I'm sure that wherever you are, you see examples of this in public and private gardens. And sometimes we don't create the garden. The garden is a prairie. This is a protected place, if you will, the Bigelow Cemetery Prairie, Bigelow family. You can see some of the monuments in the background. And we not so much plant this as care for it and edit it and make sure that invasive plants don't get in there. And all the plants that you see here, for the most part, are native plants. And this quote from Oliver Sacks is very telling. Nature calls to something very deep in us. Biophilia, the love of nature and living things, is an essential part of the human condition. Hortophilia, the desire to interact with, manage, and tend nature, is also deeply instilled in us. And it is. So a lot of our gardens, when we think of a design, it's something like this. This is a design by Gertrude Jekyll. She designed in the 1800s, late 1800s into the early 1900s in England. And there are some of her gardens, or at least designs for her gardens here in the United States. She overplanted. Oh my goodness, where one plant should go, she put 4. She also, these beautiful gardens that needed a lot of tending. This is high maintenance. And when you look at this, it looks like everything's in bloom at once. And it's not exactly that way, but a lot of these were in bloom at the same time. Lots of color, lots of maintenance. And while we like this, honestly, I prefer to see this in a public garden than in my private garden, because I don't have that much time. Traditionally, and when we teach garden design, we teach our students how to draw it out. We teach them to go onto a site and see what's there, analyze what's working, what's not, what needs to change. What does the client want? What can we give them for their dreams to come true? We create a plan that looks something like this. There are many kinds of plans, and this is from one of the books that I used when I taught at Columbus State. And, we go to a lot of effort to put it down onto paper. We use art, line, form, texture, and color, and the principles of design on the right side to create these places of use and beauty for our clients. And I just want to give you a hint. It hardly ever goes in exactly as drawn. So this is a dream that eventually gets expressed in some way on the ground. But what I like to focus on is the ecology of the place. What was there? What is there now? What can we bring back? What was there? What we won't be able to bring back. And there are times when one has to consider that native plants, and my yard is filled with native plants, but there are times when non-natives and cultivars of natives are a better choice. And as we go into climate change, and I'm not going to dwell on this, just to mention it, what's going to work in our gardens is what is adaptable, what can deal with the changes that are here and the more to come. So keep that in the back of your mind too, as you choose the plants that go into your gardens. But back to this, these are the level 3 ecoregions in the contiguous United States. And if you want this map, you can go to the EPA site, put in level 3 ecoregions and EPA, and this comes up. You can also get into the state level. Now, I have not mentioned my definition of native plant. And I don't use time, because time is a slippery slope. You know, a plant that was here before European settlement. Well, choose when that time is, go for it. And in which part of the country, because the Spanish were in California and in Florida in the 1500s. So do we go back that far? Do we go back into the fossil record and find that in the Western United States, the dawn redwood was here? Well, that was 11,000 years ago. And that might be too far. So let's get rid of time. And instead, let's think about a native plant is that its first home place was here. It's indigenous to, endemic to, the place where it evolved with its soils, its environment, and with the animals that evolved with it. That is a native plant. Is it kind of vague? Yeah. But when you come from that place, it is easier to think about what belongs in your garden and what does not. So for Ohio, and again, as I said, you can find maps like this for your own state, your own region. But when I think of Ohio, you know, I think of these 5 physiographic regions, and this is what the garden is based on at the Ohio Governor's Residence. We call it the Heritage Garden because it is the heritage of Ohio. And so we have gardens that represent many different places in Ohio, and you'll see a few of those in a moment. But you can see the gross, you know, the big map of the states, the gross level 3 regions, and now getting into level 4 and possibly even level 5 with this map. And our environments are based on the geology, the rock, which made your soil, the topography, landform. By the way, I came from Lake County up by the lake. I grew up on the Portage Escarpment, really cool landforms. And when I came down to Ohio State for college and ended up staying, there was this flat land. It's like, what happened to Ohio? Obviously, I'd not really been down to Columbus that much before, but it was so surprising to see the changes as we traveled. It is also determined by the flora and fauna that are there and the evolutionary history of the layers of earth and of the plants and animals and the environment as it changed. And so natural vegetation happens because of all of that. And if you look at Ohio, we were approximately 90% forested before, well, that's kind of hard to say before what, but usually we say in the 1600s, even though our lands had been managed by native peoples before then. But you can see that a good part of Ohio is forests. The green, pink, orange, purple, and brown, and blue are all forests. And then those interesting gold fingers, those are our prairies. And those little blobs of black, those are bogs and fens. Very interesting places. So our landscapes are natural, are continuums. So natural landscapes are continuums of different processes and characteristics. So in this case, we have drylands. We have uplands like you see on the upper left and Hocking Hills in southern part of Ohio, these rocky ledges that are very dry. And we have lowlands on the right. Those are the very sandy soils of the oak openings areas up by Toledo and up again by Lake Erie. And then just to throw in someplace very different that has uplands and lowlands, this is the land around the Mount St. Helens caldera, and a fascinating place to look at how dryness, wetness to dryness, how it occurs in landscape as landform changes. We have water and wetlands. In the upper left, that is a vernal pool. In the summer, it is dry and rock hard, and it's by the Little Darby. In the upper right, we have a fen, even though we call it the Cedar Bog. It is a fen, and there is water present throughout the season because of the water that is fed from underneath. And then we have natural lakes and streams. We also have forests and prairies. To me, that seems like on a continuum. And if you hear scratching and meowing in the background, it's because my cat wants in. When I am sitting at the computer, he thinks that my lap is his territory. So please ignore that if you hear it. It's the human element of Zooming. So, or the animal element of Zooming. So back to forests and prairies. I see them as sort of opposites, but actually along a continuum. And we're definitely in the forest in Highlands Nature Sanctuary in the upper left. And we're in an opening in the Kamama Prairie in the lower left. And then we have a wide open prairie at Battelle Darby Creek's Metro Park in the lower right. But in the upper right, we have that kind of edge. We have a forested area and then into the sand of the oak openings again. And these edges are incredibly important in our landscapes because we have this mixing of two different regimes coming together, and the biological richness on those edges are amazing. So when we create gardens, I'd like you to think like nature, mimic nature, knowing that we are not exactly replacing, but that we are at least trying to replace, return, repair. Observe places and their plants. My husband and I like to drive when we go on vacations, and we've driven as far as Arizona. We have flown into places like Oregon and California, and then we rent a car and we drive, because the only way to understand the place you're in is to be there. Of course, it is kind of interesting to look from a plane and look down and get this bird's eye view, although that's even probably higher than a bird, but a plane's eye view of land. So when I started designing in the early 90s, I thought of garden types. I'm going to make a shade garden, a sun garden, a mixed border, an herb garden, etc. But I changed. By the late 90s, I was firmly in the habitat group, looking at, well, this really reminds me of a woodland. I'm making a shady woodland garden. I'm making a sunny prairie garden. There's a lot of wet areas here. Which plants belong here in this? And instead of thinking of, well, I need to put a French drain in and dry this place out so I can put the garden of my dreams, I started thinking about what's here, not how I could change it. Even though by our very garden making, we are changing our places. Pardon me. So I want you to think like a plant. And I've chosen one of my favorite spring ephemerals, bloodroot. It only offers pollen, no nectar. It blooms in April. It gives pollinators 3 days to visit before it says, forget this, and pollinates itself. And then it drops its petals. Now, if a pollinator gets to it the first day, it drops its petals then. So this is a very short-lived flower. You better know when it's coming up in your garden to get a picture like this. In this area, it's very dry in my garden, although you can see the leaves on the ground. The leaves stay. Leave the leaves. Let that nutrition go back into the soil. Because look, this bloodroot had no problem coming up in there. So the seed pod begins to form and the leaves unfurl into this beautifully palmately compound leaf. And in this area of my garden, the leaves last till about end of May, beginning of June, because it's dry and they go dormant. In another part of my garden where the land is wetter, they have gone into late July with the leaves before they go down back into the earth. So soil moisture has a lot to do with how this plant performs in the garden. How does it survive by not being eaten? Well, the darn thing's poisonous. Very few animals want to eat this plant. At least it causes gastric upset. And it's called bloodroot because when you snap off or you go down to the root, you get the root turns sort of a reddish color, looking like blood. It creates these defenses from the nutrition that it gets from the soil and the carbohydrates that it makes during photosynthesis. And notice how it's leaning a little bit because it is reaching for the sun, because it's on the edge where there is a little bit more shade, even though the leaves aren't fully on the trees yet. Now, I do not use conventional inputs, but I've often wondered when this is on the edge of an area where there's a lawn and we put in our salt-based fertilizers and our petrochemical-based herbicides, pesticides, etc. And since I have a silty clay, how much of that is moving into the garden? And how much of those herbicides, dicot specific, which this plant is, are moving into that area? And have you ever wondered why maybe some of your gardens aren't doing as well if they're on the edge of an area that you are treating? And that's the last I'll say about that, because I'm trying not to be on too many soapboxes today. I showed this last year when I talked, and I show it in almost every talk when I talk about plants, because a lot of times we are so involved with what goes on top that we don't think about the bottom. We don't think that sometimes 2/3 of the biomass of a plant is underground. And these prairie plants, these native plants, look at how they go deep down to get what they need. And if they're on the edge with trees next to them, they have to do that because the trees, most roots stay in the top 2, 4, 5 feet of the soil. And look at how these plants are going below that so they can get nutrition from the soil, subsoil even. Some go down to bedrock. So you have your grasses and you have your forbs being the flowering plants. And look at 15 feet for the compass plant and 15 feet plus for the blazing star. It is just phenomenal. And once you start thinking of your soil, you can't help but honor it. Please stop treating your soil like dirt. So this is something that's often used in permaculture, looking at the different layers of the forest garden or the forest or the prairie or whatever. And I drew my own because I was frustrated. Didn't show enough roots, showed the roots of the trees sometimes, but I wanted to show the interaction of roots of all kinds of plants, and that we often forget that the roots of trees go far beyond the drip line of the canopy, and that roots intermingle, and that our prairie plants, are setting their roots down, and we have bulbs, corms, tubers, and rhizomes, and ground covers, and we have all these plants, and this is the smallest subset of that. And many of these are native. There are a couple that are not. So going back to that picture and just stepping back a little bit more of this back area of my yard, These are the native plants that are there now. And I think I have forgotten a few, but I was just sitting here and trying to remember. And if it had been spring, summer, or fall, I could have gone out and looked at, but I had to use my memory. Now, this is a picture from 2012. So, and it has changed significantly, because my goal now is that when something dies, in its place goes a native plant or a nativar, a cultivar of a native plant, and one that offers ecosystem services. That in itself is a whole nother talk. But in my garden, you can see in the woody plants, the DeGroote Spire American Arborvitae. Yes, that is not your typical, not what you're going to find if you go to Cedar Bog. It is a cultivar, but the birds do use it as a place to live in. So it is offering some of those ecosystem services. And I could go through all of these plants and say what they offer to this ecosystem I've created in my backyard. But instead, it's just to show you that it is easy to put native plants in your yard. And you'll possibly notice that in the background, there is the Amur honeysuckle. I battle that every year. I have taken out a lot, but I also have a bank on a stream. So what I'm doing slowly is replacing with native plants, and then just every year they get chopped back to nothing, so that they're stressed and can't flower and fruit. And I'm just trying to get the native plants to go so that I have roots holding that bank, and that eventually I can take those honeysuckles out. I also have root pruned, gone down with a saw, my root saw, and just sawed some of the base from the roots. It gets complicated. In other words, I'm trying not to use Roundup because I don't want to poison the soil. Now, stepping further back in my yard, you can see that I have a lot of plants that are not native because I am a food grower and an herb lover. In fact, food and herbs were the ways my gateway plants into horticulture. So compromise is everywhere. And I do have grass. This is a picture from 2011, and half of that grass is gone that you see there. So it looks a lot different. And I guess I need to take another picture. So how do we create designs? What is it that we do to make a design? So if you look here, I chose Pete Udolph, who's a formidable designer, amazing designs, and you'll see a couple of his designs in a moment. If you look at on the right, this is his sketch. This is the data dump. This is the form of the garden and what do you put in it. And on the left is the finished design for a portion of the new garden at the Delaware Botanic Garden. I can't wait to travel to the state of Delaware. I haven't been to Longwood or Mount Cuba for a while, and while I'm there, I need to go here too. But he has his own way of designing, and again, not everything goes in exactly the way it's designed. And I love what Pete Udolph said in an interview. Wait 1 year, then we see what we have done wrong. So keep that philosophy in mind. And I'm working with Denise and the Partners in Pollination group, and we're putting together simple gardens that are going to be tested across the state of Ohio this coming year. There's a bumblebee garden for plants, bumblebee pollinators, plants, and specialist. This is just a simple 6x10 plan. And in this case, there's 8 or 9 plants, whatever. And it's not meant to be beautiful. It's meant to show you the relative position of the plants in the garden. Each one of those squares is a square foot, and that helps you place the plants. It is not anywhere near as complicated as what Pete Udolph does. And here is the specialist design. And we also have also have alternatives in case some of them don't work. But we're looking at how we can get the most in a 6x10 space. Now, you could take these very same plants and put them in a space that is more curvilinear, that has the same square feet, 60 square feet. So then I started thinking, how could I make this simpler? So I started thinking of, okay, 5 plants. Which 5 plants could I use to get season from spring, summer, fall for a bumblebee and a specialist bee? And this is what I came up with. And we are going to be publishing these. So these will be coming out somehow, and we're still working on that. But these are options for if you don't have a plan in your mind, this is a great place to start. And if these aren't the plants you want, then look at this plant and think, well, you know, I'm not really into Penstemon digitalis, but what other spring blooming plant does a bumblebee or a specialist bee like? And then you just sort of, it's like a puzzle. It's like a puzzle. So let's look at some of the plants let's look at some designs, some places that have been designed with native plants in mind. This is the old prairie garden at the Heritage Garden at the governor's residence. And we have since moved it to a different area, and this space has been redone, and it is a beautiful mix of natives and non-natives. And this went to a different area that made more sense within the scope of the gardens at the residence. So as you look here, you can see the compass plant over on the left, tall, majestic, and then closer in the center of the screen and over to the right, you can see the prairie dock. Someone calls those Dumbo ears. Oh, please, I hope that common name doesn't make it out there. A prairie dock or a Silphium terebinthinaceum is a much better term to use. There's also gray coneflower, the Rattipata, and there's the beautiful frothy euphorbia in the white that you can see dotted out through the plan. And of course, purple coneflower and a little spot of the royal catchfly in the back. And you can see, by the way, this is a point that I need to make. You know those garden plans I showed you? Well, in about 3 years, they're going to look a lot different because these plants like to move out. They self-seed, they move around. And as Pete Udolph said, in 1 year, we look and we figure out what we have done wrong. So I have to show you, this is one of my all-time favorite summer plants. It is a Hummingbird Magnet. You can see by the long, deep, where the nectaries are. I'm just blanking, talking about so many different things. But what's interesting is there's very few robbing incidences where a bumble will chew into the base of the tube, the nectary tube, to get the nectar because it's sticky. Royal catchfly to catch. And it's very, I don't know if a bumblebee would be caught, but I know that if you look at this during the season, you'll see little gnats and other little insects stuck to the sticky nectary tube. I don't know whether or not there are butterflies and moths that interact with this plant, but this plant needs to be in more gardens. It's spectacular. This is one of Pete Udolph's designs, the Lurie Garden in Chicago in Millennium Park. And there's just the backdrop. There are 2 trees. There's the European beech and the Sweet Bay magnolia. And then you're looking at Culver's root, and you're looking at 2 cultivars of our perennial phlox. And in the front, you're looking at the great blue lobelia. I have not quite figured out what the small plant is. At first, I thought it was master, but I'm not sure. But these plants, you know, this was in August, beginning of August, and it's a simple design. And I will tell you, I was there with a group from Garden Comp, And the curator of the garden told us that they manage this garden and that the plants have moved over time. And that Pete Udolph does come to the garden and say, no, we need to take this back. We need to move this. And oh, I see this plant hasn't lasted. There has been a lot of tweaking of the plan from when it was originally put in. If you walk just 10 feet to the left as you're looking at the border, it becomes a 2-plant border. It's Joe Pyeweed and straight garden phlox, although I think I see a couple of Laura in there, the cultivar Laura. And it's a stunning design, and it's 2 plants. And I wasn't here to get pollinator shots in this instance, but I did get some fantastic pollinator shots in other parts of the garden. It also was not the best time of day to take pictures because we were there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So it was not easy to get pictures. So that's the sun. Let's go into the shade. This is in my garden in the back. And 2 plants here are not native. The little lily of the valley in the back and the Trillium Ludium is actually native to southeastern United States. Not here, but I love it. So it's in my garden. But here it is keeping, the big, beautiful maple leaf looking plant that you see is our endangered golden seal. And it's just loving it back there. And it didn't love it back there until I let the leaves stay. And now it is entirely happy. When I planted this, they were each in their own little spaces, but they have now created a community that is this rich tapestry that you see here. And the lily of the valley does not run roughshod over other plants. I think there was a discussion between golden seal and lily of the valley as to who was going to be where. This is another shade place. This is was a garden of a friend of mine who's no longer with us, but he decided, well, one of his favorite plants was Virginia bluebells, so he planted his whole hillside with it. At one point, he had hostas in there also, but the deer found they loved those, and those disappeared, and he started putting more native plants in. What's rather ironic is that a lot of our native plants are also loved by deer and are deer food. So I guess the trick is putting enough in, or putting the poisonous ones in like bloodroot, so that you have some plants left, or that you have enough that you get to see them and the deer get to eat them too. This is another place. This was another place in Ed's garden. Beautiful tapestry of the white trout lily and the celandine poppy and the large flowered bellwort, and dabbled in there also the spring beauties. Just beautiful combinations of spring ephemerals, although a lot of times the celandine poppy will continue to be in place. And I've even had a couple stray blooms in midsummer. It surprises me when that happens. It's when we have a lot of rain. That's when I'll get that. Spigelia, another place in my yard, trying to get Spigelia to take hold. I've seen large stands of it, and I also found out that it is one of my resident deer's favorite foods. So I have different ways of trying to keep them away. I've planted ferns. This was when I initially planted them the first year. And now I put in more ferns around them because deer do not like ferns. And I've looked at other poisonous plants that I could put in here that maybe will protect my Spigelia. I don't know. We'll see. I'll let you know. Whoops, sorry, too far. This is a beautiful design by Nadia Malarkey in Yellow Springs. And this was for one of her clients, and common plants, but look how beautifully they come together. And they do some editing over time, but mostly the garden has created this tapestry itself with oak leaf hydrangea in the background. So there's something to see in the winter. That's something to think about. Which of these have winter show like Echinacea does? And then the little blue stem. and the rattlesnake master and the Budaloa, the side oats grandma, beautiful plants that ebb and flow in this garden. And that's something that you have to learn too, is that after you plant a garden, after you design it, you change from designer to editor. This is a place in the Heritage Garden. It is a dune from the oak openings. You saw that red sand earlier in the talk. Well, we got some red sand. We built up the dune. We had to hold the sand in with the logs that you see there. And this is in 2015. The reason I'm pointing it out is that not all native plants are the best plants to put in your garden. Yes, to Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly weed, but think twice before you put in the plant that is at the feet of this butterfly weed, and that is one of the equisetums, probably Equisetum arvense, the field horsetail. Once you put it in, it never goes away, and it can have an effect on other plants, stopping them from being able to grow as well. So be judicious in which native plants you choose to put in, and leave Equisetum in its natural places where it has competitors that keep it more or less in its place. This is another part. This is the cedar glade at the Heritage Garden. And here you can see the butterfly weed again and other plants. And it is in this garden that I had one of my most incredible experiences. There were a group of us, and it's not a video because one, the video didn't turn out as well as I'd like. So it's going to be a moving from slide to slide. But in fall, the bottle gentians were in bloom. And we were watching several bumblebees pollinate the bottle gentians. So ready? Here we go. There she is. I'm assuming it's she because it's the fall, opening the flower, working her way in. Here we get to see just her fuzzy butt. There she is, pollinating. And now she's back out and on to the next flower. I don't know, but that made me happy for the whole day. And I kept looking at that series of pictures thinking, that is one strong bumblebee. And especially also thinking, what kind of strength would I have to have in my arms to do a similar task? And I think this is the way that we learn the most, by watching the interactions between the plants and the animals in our gardens when the plants are planted in the right places. Which brings me to this one. Beautiful, beautiful Lakeside Daisy, endemic to just Kelly's Island in the Marblehead Peninsula in Ohio. And when a population is that small, if we don't conserve it, it will go away. So we have a special place for it, the Alvar in the Heritage Garden. And we brought stones from Kelly's Island into this garden and transplanted, got seed, started seed, transplanted small plants into this garden. So we have a representative colony of the Lakeside Daisy in Columbus, Ohio. And when it's in bloom, this is another thing that makes me smile all day, pollinated by a bunch of many bees. And one of these days, I'm just going to sit there with my phone and document pollination time, but just haven't had time to do that because usually when I'm in the garden, I'm working. And just a small announcement, right now, I'm the interim garden manager of the Heritage Garden. So for the next 6 months, this garden is mine before I turn it over to a permanent garden manager. And we are looking for that person. So I'm putting a plug in. I hadn't initially thought of doing that, but it just sort of occurred to me. So if this is something that excites you and you're in the Columbus area, let me know. great resource we have here in Ohio is the website ohionativeplantmonth.org. On this site, there is a resource list of where you can find native plants, and also a Excel spreadsheet that Hope Taft and I will put together on different native plants and where they come from. And that tells you whether or not you'll be able to grow it, whether it's the right plant for the conditions you have on your home ground. So please take a look. And while it won't work for you in Colorado and Utah, the folks there who have joined us, and South Africa, I am sure that you have your own resources to go to find out where you can get those plants and which plants are native to your home place. I also want to mention that sometimes we construct a wetland. This may not have been there a long time ago, but this was an area that was waterlogged. And if you're interested in hearing a little bit more of the story, you can go on to my website where I have a 5-minute video that talks about what we did in this place that was a mess, that had a building on it. The building was taken down. It is a wetland regime in this area, and they couldn't get the right thing to grow. So we constructed a wetland, and the top picture is 2 weeks after our Earth Day planting. And then 3 months after, look at how it has filled in. 3 months after, and these were all plugs, 3,700 and some odd plugs. And it is still growing and beautiful, and it has changed in its composition as the plants have moved around. One of my favorite quotes, and it's actually on my phone. I look at it every day, every time I use my phone. Our greatest problems result from the difference between how people think and how nature works. Why do we do this to trees? There are better ways to do this, but this tree obviously is surviving. And look at the diameter of this tree. It obviously has figured out how to live underneath those bricks, but in the meantime, it has girdling roots and it's not long for this world. But there it is. Don't do this in your yard. And finally, another one of my favorite quotes, because I couldn't leave you with that picture to end my talk. And I'll let you read it yourself, but this is what we do. We have dreams, visions of paradise. And no matter what we create, whether it is just a small garden on a balcony, or it is a backyard full of native plants, or a front yard, or even just one container. I mean, it's based on the expectation of a beautiful spot. So this hope for the future is at the heart of all gardening. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Deb. So wonderful and such great images and descriptions. I really love the very lyrical way that you present. There were a number of people who want to come to the Heritage Garden, and maybe you can talk about, is it open? How do people schedule that?
We used to have tours every Tuesday, but with COVID, the residence is being careful. I just spoke to the residence manager about when tours could start. We can have small tours, 5 to 10 people, 10 people max, on Wednesday mornings. At this point, we would really like to bring back the Tuesday tours. And we're watching the numbers go down in Ohio, just like everyone else is watching numbers of COVID infections. And I, for one, would love to welcome people back in the garden. We've not had you in the garden for 2 seasons, and that's just awful. And so I hope for this 3rd season, we will be able to get people in. So thank you very much. Would love to see you in the garden.
Great, thanks, Deb. And folks, we're at the top of the hour. I see some folks are putting a thank you into Deb. I know she appreciates that if you have to hop off, but we're going to continue with some questions. And so, Deb, the question that came to the top was your thoughts on pruning shrubs in particular, but shrubs and trees in the landscape in native settings.
For the most part, the reason, and I have a whole pruning lecture, but and why we prune, but first of all, I do my best to choose plants that won't outgrow their space. I have made mistakes. If you visit my garden, I will show you every one. So I will prune, always will prune dead and diseased limbs off. I also prune to bring boxwood in during the winter, but for the most part, I try not to prune. I will correct structural problems because once again, we bring these trees and shrubs into our landscape, so we are responsible for them. And I have pruned some of my larger trees to limb them up a bit because my gardens became so dark that I wasn't able to grow underneath some trees. So yes, I do prune, but do it judiciously. Although I have one ginkgo in my garden that was supposed to be a dwarf and has switched back to growing 12 to 14 inches a year. And it got a severe prune last fall, and we'll see how it does. And it may get the severest prune of all.
So the ground level pruning.
Yes.
Very severe. Deb, there was a question about, are there plant families that give us the best bang for our buck? And I realize we have folks from all over the country, but maybe your thoughts on that.
So if you mean bang for buck in growing or with animals?
In terms of making a healthy ecological garden.
Well, first of all, I mean, the first step is to go see what was there, what your gardens can support. Look at the native plants for your home place. And then you'll probably notice that there's a lot of mint family. There's a lot of the aster family. There's a lot of the celery parsley family. And I'm using the common names. I can use the botanical names if you would like. A lot of the pea and bean family. These are our big major families, but there are so many others too. I remember being on a mountaintop. My husband usually drives when we're traveling, and there we are in the Rocky Mountains in the Front Range. And I'm reading some of the guides because I'm trying to look at these plants and figure out what we're going to see. And in there, the author talked about, and I'm going to swear here, ADCs, another damn composite. So, and we saw so many daisies, they're all over the place. So you will be putting in a lot of the daisies, the Asteraceae. And for me, it's not so much the families, although when I think of herbs, I do think of different families because the mint family is my all-time favorite family. But I don't only think ecologically is the whole package. And which one of these will be good for the bees? Which one will be good for the butterflies, the hummingbirds, the turtles that every once in a while come in my yard, the toads, the frogs, and also for me, for supper. Yeah. So I wish I could say that I'll just stop there because I'm rambling.
There were lots of questions about the royal catchfly, and that was your hummingbird choice, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hummingbird. And I wondered, I've tried to sit there and watch to see if there are any long butterflies, long proboscis, but it seems to be the hummingbird for the most part, and very small things that I don't know what they are going in and out that also get caught on the nectary tube.
Thanks. So several questions. Folks are interested in your opinion on nativars. Some of your images, quite a few, showed different cultivars and just kind of how you feel on straight species versus use of cultivars.
That's a huge question, and I'll put it as simply as possible. Natives are the ones that evolved with the other things in the environment, animal, soil, etc. So that's your first place. But there are times when it's not always easy to find the natives, and you find nativars instead. If I use a nativar, it's one that gives the same, or as darn close the same, ecological services that the species does. And I always pick on poor echinacea. Straight species echinacea has that beautiful cone. The powder puff echinaceas, the ones that the cone was bred to turn into petaloid structures, offers little to no ecological services in the garden. And not only that, the deer eat them right away because there's no protection. So for me, I will always gravitate to a nativar that has the same features, the same nectar pollen sources as far as I can tell, or the same leaves that the caterpillars can eat. That's what I will choose first if I go to a nativar. And also, I'm a horticulturist. I test things out. I bring nativars into my yard so I can see, are they visited the same way that my species are? And if you want an answer to that question, Mount Cuba and I think Cornell both are doing great work at looking at who visits what. And I think our next question is, who visits the non-natives too? I want that question answered. There are some non-natives in my garden that get nobody, and there are others that get a lot. So again, it's one of those interesting continuums when you go from species, nativars that work, nativars that don't work, non-natives, and then of course in the very end are invasives, and we know we don't want those.
Yeah, and it's a complicated question. There are so many different answers and not enough research dollars and people to look at all the questions.
I know.
A lot of good groups really spending some time to try to check that out. There were a number of questions about leaves. When to leave them, when to shred them, how deep you like to leave them.
This is what I do. The leaves that are on the lawn, a lot of times early on, we'll just mulch them. But later when the red silver maple crosses do their leaf dump, I rake them all up and put them in different areas to sit and compost. And then that's the compost I use in the middle of the summer when it is hot and dry and the ground is opening up. The leaves that fall in the beds, they stay. I don't do anything to them. I don't shred them. In fact, sometimes the wind will blow by and blow the leaves back and blow them out, and I put them back in. I do get shredded leaves from our township. I get a big load of them. They go into some of my pathways woodland pathways, and they also go on the edges of all my gardens. And that keeps and then I let the organisms in the soil take it in. But I leave the leaves. The exceptions are around my heucheras. I sometimes will just pull a little bit away because they're sensitive. But, and these are Heuchera villosa, cultivars of our native heuchera. But many plants just come right up through. And as you saw, the bloodroot had no problem at all.
Any specific advice for dealing with a lot of oak leaves?
Oak leaves are better shredded. They will break down faster. They are probably amongst the slower ones to shred. However, and this is something really important, when you shred your leaves, you might also be shredding the eggs or the larvae or the caterpillars or the insects that have taken cover underneath those. So again, while I do mulch the early ones on the lawn, for the most part, I don't shred my leaves that are in the gardens because I'm hoping that that's the nursery for my next year's insect observations.
Great. And finally, to get us kind of thinking about the season that's upon us, your thoughts on spring cleanup. When do you like to get into the garden? What do you do in the fall versus the spring from an ecological perspective?
I do very little in the fall. In the fall, I take out diseased plants. I clean up, this is not native, but the leaves from my peonies, which are covered with powdery mildew. So I clean up broken branches. If the cut plant is down on the ground, I will cut those off, or I'll cut them in half, because I like to leave stems up, because they become future nurseries too. In the spring, I may cut some plants down, and I leave most of the litter. In the backyard, the litter stays in those gardens. In the front yard, that's my public face. And as it is, I'm the weird person on the block. So, I try not to do too many strange things. But there is a little bit more cleanup in the spring, because, plants are growing up. I cut down my leaves, and I will chop them from some of my grasses and leave them in a pile. And I then see those leaves woven into bird nests. So I do things that I hope are supportive, and try to harm as little as possible, keeping a lookout for any bumbles, especially. And I also have open soil areas that I do not disturb in the spring. So it's a combination. In fact, I've been doing less and less and less maintenance over time. And as for mulches, the only time I'll use mulch is if by some chance someone says, hey, I have some free mulch that goes in the front yard to make it look pretty. So I've become a lazy gardener in certain aspects, but there still is a lot of maintenance. I still edge my beds, because that makes them legal looking in the front yard, because there's not a lot of grass in the front yard anymore. And on and on. Again, if you're in Columbus, let me know. You can come and look.
Somebody always shares this idea, Deb, of the mullet approach to gardening, where the business end is in front and the party's in the back. So
right.
And people have been commenting in the chat box about some of your great quotes. So maybe that'll stick with the folks as well. Don't treat your soil like dirt. I didn't ask.
Well, I hope to read some of these later on. I'll go and look at the chat. Is the chat available on YouTube?
Not on YouTube, but I do sometimes post the chat.
Okay,
good. Save it if anybody's interested. You can save your chat to your computer. Finally, Deb, your books, Lone Pine still publishing? Are they available? I think people.
A lot of them are available as used books. The perennials, Gardening Month by Month, and Best Plants for Ohio are all out of print, but they are floating around. You can find them in used bookstores. And I keep saying I'm going to work on a book. I need to update the perennials book. I really want to put more natives in, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, I keep doing too many other things. And a book takes a really, focused approach. So,
well, if putting off the book gets you to our webinars, I appreciate that, Deb. I know you're very busy in all your design work and teaching, but really enjoyed having you here today. We do have a recorded session from Deb from last year. If you go to the B Lab website, you can access that, or our YouTube channel. And Deb, thanks for inspiring everyone. Give us lots of great images, some thoughts, some additions for our garden, some hope that we can do this.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Bye.